Cool. So today I'm going to be talking about microservices. It's going to be hopefully pretty exciting, as much as exciting as these things can be. My name is Marcus Merrell. I'm the head of Director of Technical Services for Sauce Labs, a role I have had for 5 months, which is evidently not long enough to learn how to say it. So if you have a team of folks, test automation, you're a Sauce Labs customer, you want to know more about hardcore technical implementation, that's what my team is here for. I'm also the co-chair of the Selenium Conference Planning Committee, which means that if you've gone to a Selenium conference in the last 8 years, I've been up on stage doing something like moderating panels or stepping out of the way while better speakers get up there to talk. So, cool. I'm actually not talking about any of that stuff today. I'm talking about a role that I just left fairly recently at a company called retailmenot.com, which is 4 blocks up the road. I don't suppose any of my former coworkers are in the audience, are they? Can you raise your hand? No, I don't think so. So we were a Sauce Labs customer, and we were quite successful, I think. And one of the things that we did as I was there was we broke a gigantic, horrible PHP, CSS, monolithic website up into a whole bunch of microservices. And the lights are really bright, but I do want to ask for a show of hands. Who is undergoing a similar kind of transition right now? Because I know it's several. Right, gigantic ball of mud that nobody can penetrate, and you're breaking it up, and you're breaking it up, and you're breaking it up, and you're trying to figure out, what is the role that I play here? Why did they decide to do what they did? What am I doing in this role? How can I increase my impact on this role? What can I do along the way? And what is my responsibility? What should I be held accountable for as this transition is going on? Didn't get my animations right on this thing. So, one of the first things that we assume when we start this conversation is that, management has already made the assumption for you. I can tell you that microservices are better, right? They've made that assumption or they wouldn't have made the decision. However, there are some pros to the monolith that kind of get lost along the way. For one thing, it was working. It was working. You built a business around it, probably quite successful if you have the money to do something like break it up into microservices. It was a unified tech stack, so kind of everyone in the company probably understood it. There may at some point have been one person who understood all of it, or at least a group of people. You knew who the gurus were you could go to. And when anyone got onboarded into the project, it was always the same. So there's a lot of advantages in those 3 things. Now, the cons are, of course, it's harder to fix bugs because you don't know where all the bodies are buried. Somebody does, but you probably don't. You have to dig in, and since there probably weren't a whole lot of unit tests, you probably don't know what all's being broken whenever you make any given change. And it's harder to make big changes. I'm going to spend roughly half of this time talking about an anti-pattern that we ran into at Retail Me Not, which is where we had to take a monolith that we had broken up into 13 tech stacks, 13 separate microservices, and then we did one change to all of them on the same day. And at some point during this process, you question, should we have just done this back when it was a monolith? Should we go back to those days? So I'll tell that story in a bit. So the pros for microservices, now these things you're probably familiar with now, being knee-deep in this conversation. Developers in different areas can use the best tool that fits their situation. So if you're dealing with a database, you're dealing with a machine learning part of your B2C app, something like that, you can use Python. If you're dealing with the front end, you can use React Native, you can use React JS and JavaScript. And the testers who work for these teams can choose to work within their own frameworks as well. Now, this talk is primarily aimed at what we traditionally call QA or testers. It is also intended to benefit developers and managers as well, but primarily when I say you, intentionally I'm sort of talking to the testers in the room, but everyone else I hope can follow along. And so the other advantage of microservices, and this is key, is the ability to release independently from each other. So you no longer have to wait until next quarter for your feature to go in if it's done and ready to go and you have to wait for the big monolith to ship, right? We learned this morning that there's still a surprising number of companies that only ship twice a year, right? I think we heard that from the keynote. Well, in a microservices architecture, you can ship independently and you can be long gone with that particular feature that was important to you and not worry so much about waiting for the big one. The difficulty once again, the story I'll be telling is about how difficult it is to coordinate when you have to make changes across the organization, across the ecosystem all at once. Those things are incredibly difficult to orchestrate when you have a microservices architecture. I don't know if you follow Uber engineers on Twitter, but there's been a bit of a storm in the last few weeks when somebody released a diagram of their microservices architecture with well over, 1,200 microservices. They even got into the realm of nanoservices, where there's a microservice that has 2 endpoints in it. And those things have dependencies, which have dependencies, which have dependencies on the other dependencies. And it becomes every bit as much of a nightmare as a monolith. In my opinion, it becomes a different kind of monolith. So that's difficult. And along the way, silos can be built, and teams can get disconnected from each other, and you have the invisible wall problem that you were trying to solve in the first place. So these are things to watch out for as we make the transition. So what do we do while this is going on? We as testers, we as QA folks, we as developers, what are we doing? Well, one thing I see a lot, I haven't seen it since I've become in this position, but in my role at Retail Me Not and before that, I found a lot of testers and developers, when product managers were talking during release planning, they're on their laptops, they're not engaged. They're supposed to be talking about and thinking about and analyzing all the different features that are going to go out and what dependencies are required in order to ship before they go, and they're just sort of checked out. And I want to challenge everyone to stop that yesterday. You need to sit there and you need to engage. Understand the decisions, educate yourself about the stack. There's so much information on the internet now, it's almost more difficult to find, to find which article rather than finding any article to read. And you should be establishing rapport with people, especially in product. If you're in QA talking to product, you are both intended to be the representatives of the customer, the proxies for the customer. And then understand how testing is different in microservices around data modeling, because it's a much better problem to have data modeling in a microservice architecture than a monolith. In a monolith, you have to start thinking about everything along the end-to-end workflow in order to be able to create test data. In a microservice, you're concerned with a very small, it's comparable to like a city instead of a planet worth of data. Mocking out other services so that you don't have to worry about whether or not the environments have been maintained or whether or not you have the right version. Mocking out endpoints while you're doing testing will help a lot. Also worrying about performance and whether or not the service is performing as it should according to SLAs and benchmarks that you already have. And also how to test contracts. Come to think of it, that should have been the first bullet point. Does everyone know what I mean when I say contract? I see a lot of head nodding. Okay, I think everyone knows. When I started doing this, some earlier version of this talk a couple of years ago, a lot of QA folks in the room did not know what contracts mean. So I'm very, very glad that the word is getting out on what contracts mean. If you don't know what it means, I will define it. So the question you should be asking every single day, twice a day, is what we're working on testable? You should be doing this in any environment, but particularly when you're making the transition to microservices, we should be asking, is what we're doing testable? Do I have discoverability, examinability? What's the other word? There's a better word for it. To be able to look and introspect into a service to find out if it's in the correct state to begin testing or something like that. So you want to ask, are there hooks in there for you? Are there endpoints that are being exposed that can help you create data or look at something, maybe something that isn't even available in production, it's just available in the lower environments? Do you have access to the code itself? Once again, not exactly a microservice question. This could be monolith or micro, this could be traditional anything. Do you have access to the code? Are you looking at code? It's helpful. Can you add endpoints when they're lacking? Do you have the permissions and the trust of the developer to go in and add these testability hooks yourself? And then, are there unit tests? A lot of controversy these days about who should be writing unit tests. In my opinion, we should all be conversant with how to write them so that we can read them well, right? Another thing that we get caught up a lot on is things like CAPTCHA and multi-factor authentication. Who knows the answer to this question? Should we be doing CAPTCHA testing with Selenium? The answer is no, right? So don't ever test CAPTCHA with Selenium. In other words, when you have CAPTCHA, something like that, multi-factor, two-factor authentication in lower environments, you'll want to make sure that you can bypass that because it's inappropriate to use Selenium for such a task. because it simply wasn't. Those things are built specifically to keep robots out. So you need to be able to modify the lower environment so that you can bypass that kind of authentication with a cookie or a JWT or some sort of authentication. And you can build endpoints to create these kinds of situations yourself and ask for help from the developers, because I've seen more than one project get hung up on this particular question, which seems so easy to solve. And then if there are some third-party tools, vendors like Salesforce, like Facebook, anything where you have to make an external call, usually that is synchronous, where the microservice is going to be blocked and it has to come back, are you going to have to be responsible for testing those? Can you mock and stub out those endpoints so that they don't get in the way of your testing? Because if your software is ready to go, but you can't even finish testing it because some other service is down, how can you move forward? You don't want to be blocked on something like that. So, first of all, let's talk more about contracts. Contracts are a definition for an API. And a microservice that you produce should have a contract available so that everyone who interacts with the API knows exactly what endpoints are available, what parameters they take, what types of parameters those are, and what the return codes are for them. This particular contract example comes from an open source project that a colleague of mine at RetailMeNot created. The project is called Shiva. And Meredith Gardner is her name. She created a project that uses JavaScript to read contracts and generate test cases based on those contracts. It's not intended to be a comprehensive solution for testing, but it allows you to get a jump start on pointing at a contract Swagger doc and say, I need to generate a bunch of test cases for that. And it gets you started. So I'd recommend having a look at that. For each endpoint, you get the details on how the format of it is, the parameters, the typing, everything like that. That's a contract. And what I mean when I say contract's a big word, right? It's a big, scary legal word. And what it means is that when you publish as a microservice creator or supporter, when you publish a contract, that means we're going to shake hands and agree that when I call this endpoint, I'm getting this response back. And that's more or less set in stone. So that when microservice A makes a change and they have to change the way their API works, they say they have to wait and they have to very carefully consider, well, how do I conform to my contract? Am I breaking my contract? Because if I break that contract, then dependency on microservice B won't be able to run their tests. They won't be able to function properly. So it means you have to republish a new contract with a new version and make sure that you can get the handshake set every time you run a set of tests so that you can guarantee that everything keeps functioning smoothly. Pursuant to that is the idea of versioning endpoints. I will not name the service. There was a service I was working with at one point where the URL was always the same, and about every 4 months you'd get failing something would fail, and then 2 hours later you get an email that says, by the way, we updated our API this morning, you might want to update your scripts. Believe that is happening less and less these days, but if they had versioned their endpoints, we would have been able to say, all right, well, we're going to stick with the old one until you force us to move to the new one. We're going to stick with V1 or V2, even though you've published V3. I'm going to try to get to an example here. Version your endpoints. I had the example in the wrong place. So the idea is you have a V2 in there, and that way you can pin yourself to that. And then you are on notice that at some point this is going to break. We're going to stop supporting this. But in the meantime, you can have time now to plan for it. It's very similar to just garden variety deprecation of code. You're on notice. This could go away at any time. So another really important topic that's become kind of a favorite of mine is feature flags. Let's see a show of hand for feature flags. Are people using these now? Because 2 years ago, I'd probably get 3 hands raised. I'm very gratified to see it. It's probably about 40% from what I could tell. Feature flags are the ability to turn off and on code through the UI, usually through the UI. I'm going to use that for the moment. You can turn code on and off via the UI, which gives you the ability to deploy code into production in the off state so that it has no effect on the rest of the code. The implications of this are pretty profound when you think about it. And it's kind of a next level thinking, but if you can ask some intelligent questions as this is getting started, as the feature flags are being made, it's going to be very helpful for your testing process. When you write code to a feature flag, what it means is that you're basically putting if statements around entire blocks of new code that says, if this flag is on, behave this way. If this flag is off, behave this way. In your lower environment, you test it with it on, you test it with it off. The most powerful thing about this, however, is that normally when you're deploying a new feature, you're deploying new software, and somebody says, well, how do you roll it back? Usually the answer is, well, you can't. We got to fix this forward or we have to revert. When you code for a feature flag, you have necessarily and absolutely given yourself a mechanism to turn it off if there's a problem. And the implications of that are fairly astounding, because if you get some monitoring, some APM, some signal that tells you that something is wrong, the days of hours and hours and hours of outages, in most cases, are over, because you can simply turn it off. Your application understands how to work in both states simultaneously. The other advantage of feature flags is that you can put software into production and, at least to some degree, measure the amount of risk of regression just by deploying it. Now, there's some cases that this doesn't work for, like database schema changes, stuff like that. But for the most part, feature flags can be a very, very powerful addition to a microservices architecture. And these are the kinds of questions that I think we as testers, you as developers should be asking. Are we doing this in the right place and meticulously to create testability and rollback ability? So, use feature flags. Somebody was asking me, how do you get through 56 slides in 35 minutes? Well, you put one word on each. You roll right through them. So here are some vendors that do, I'm not being paid, but Toggles and Optimizely. There's also LaunchDarkly is another vendor for feature flags. Very, very powerful. This is the kind of thing that sort of changed my life, because I got into a situation where we were discussing how do you deal with production errors. And when feature flags, the sort of light came on for me about feature flags, it was like, oh, that's how we deal with production errors. It's not that we're going to be less careful. It's not that we're going to test less. It means that we have the ability to confidently switch this back off if there's a problem. Minutes, not days. And then kind of a simple note about synchronicity. At Retail Me Not, we used to have a process that would send analytics to a vendor. And those analytic signals would block on the web page. So if you have a Retail Me Not's coupon site, savings destination. So a bunch of coupons. And when you click on something, we're sending a user analytic event to tell another, our BI process what the user has done. That signal used to go to a website and would come back from that website. And we found that occasionally they had outages and occasionally they were slow. It was a blocking call, which means our website was being slowed down every time this thing even had the slightest tick up. So what we did was we decided we were going to do this asynchronously instead. We would send the analytics to a RabbitMQ server and forget about it. You would at no point be blocked by any process that was related to that. And once we got the bug for asynchronous, we started doing that with everything. And our page performance just accelerated. So process synchronicity is very important for testers and developers to understand, because before you get stuck into a diagram like this nightmare, you can actually mitigate. You can stay ahead of it. I'm not going to explain what all that means. I don't have any idea what it means. So as you're developing, you want to know what's your responsibility. Given what we've just gone through, that's a lot of material, and there's a lot of implications behind all of it. There's career paths behind all of those things. What is my responsibility? And I think the responsibility is to ask these questions. Hold the team accountable when you ask these questions. Identify the risks. I've come in my 20-year QA career to believe that risk mitigation and risk description is one of the most valuable services that we can provide. Microservices change that discussion a little bit, and it makes it a lot more accessible. Usually, if in a gigantic monolithic application, risk is so complicated, it's undescribable. But in a microservices architecture, a small, what do they call it, a two-pizza team, a squad, can understand the risks and implications of everything that they do up and down the line. So it becomes easy for us to start to talk that way. So setting expectations, identifying the data flow, and mocking out API calls as a service to other microservices is a very powerful service that you can offer. So translating requirements to UX is kind of a well-known thing, but once again, in a microservices universe, it is much more accessible as a topic. You can test to the contracts now. You can understand the unit integration tests that the developers are producing because, once again, it is so much more digestible. The largest microservice we produced at RetailMeNot had something like 30 endpoints. We could do 30 endpoints, right? It's a 4-month project. 30 endpoints is not at all out of this realm of believability. And now you can have time to do fun stuff like CI builds and DevOps. So, once again, we're going to hit the hammer on risk quite a bit. Data generation, mocking, and all of this stuff. These are all different in microservices. I think I've probably hit those points well enough. I'm trying to go forward so I can tell my little story. I've only got 13 minutes left. Let's talk about definition of done. We were talking about this a little bit this morning, and I think that this is another sort of life-changing realization when you come to understand just how powerful the definition of done is for your work. If you can start to describe from a business or user standpoint what this looks like when we are done, normally what we do as testers is we try to describe a state of the software. We try to say there are no outstanding bugs. There are no outstanding Sev1, Sev2 bugs. There are this many test cases written. Our code coverage level has reached a certain amount. And the problem is that not only does that apply to every project under the sun, but it has nothing to do with your users. We are the user advocate. We are the headlights. We illuminate the path that users take. And we need to know what is the user's state when we are done with something. So I messed up the animation on this next slide, so I apologize. But here's a good example of a definition of done. At the end of this milestone, all users will know use the new security procedure for login and password creation. Legacy data will still flow for older OS versions until legacy traffic falls below a threshold. That's business driven. Here's a bad example. All tickets are in pending release, test plans are executed passing, stakeholders are alerted, no outstanding bugs. To me, that's lazy because, like I said, that applies to any project ever written in the history of anything. It's a completely generic, non-business driven definition of done. When you nail the definition of done and you see it in action, you start to feel the power of understanding the system. So here's the highlighted words. And story time. I have 6 minutes to tell a 20-minute story, so I'll try to make this real quick. There is a thing that we have in this world, PII. I think some of us understand what that is, especially B2C people. Personally identifiable information. Your name, your address, in some cases your email address, that one's a little bit fuzzy. Your phone number, your height, weight, everything. That's personally identifiable information. When you give that to us, we cannot share that. There's laws around it. RetailMeNot did not gather this kind of information until one day we started to. So we started to realize we were holding more sensitive information and we needed a more secure token than just an 8-digit identifier for each individual user. We started using something called a JWT, a JavaScript Web Token. It actually might stand for JSON Web Token. Somebody can correct me later. But it's a secure, new kind of authentication that we are passing around as a society now. What we needed to do as we were going through our monolith, we had rewritten the monolith into 13 different tech stacks. We'd hidden all of it behind a GraphQL service. And GraphQL is a Facebook-driven thing. You can probably look it up, but it's essentially a service of services. It allows you to query services a little bit like SQL as opposed to traditional REST API calls, which are a little bit more complicated. And that sat and translated the requests for 13 different microservices underneath. None of those had JWTs. All of them started to deal with JWTs, and that was the requirement. You have 1 year, you need to introduce a secure method of authentication as opposed to the one you've had before, which is a little bit less secure. And we kind of said, oh, wish we had done this back when we were a monolith, because this is what it looked like before. Giant blob of code. not to scale. And it would talk to a database. The database would talk back to the monolith. And wouldn't it be easier to inlay some gigantic security authentication mechanism into this back when we were all one team of 45 developers and a bunch of QA folks? Well, we couldn't. Here's what it looked like now, and this is greatly oversimplified. Every one of these systems needed to go from the way it was before to becoming JWT enabled. And so when they came to me, they said, we're going to apply this. How are you going to test it? And I said, we don't even know how to release this. Don't try to read that. It's terrible. That was my first cut at the plan for how do we release this thing. Can you imagine? We don't even know how to release it. How do you push the button? You have 13 different teams, and all of them have been working at a different pace and a different tech stack with different requirements to implement roughly the same technology. Luckily, they all used feature flags. They all versioned their endpoints. They all published their contracts. So what we had to do was put together a series of hour-long conversations with each individual team to say, what in production would prevent you from turning on your flag? And they would say, well, that team over there has a thing they need to do. Okay, so then we'll sequence it. We'll put their thing before your thing. Okay, great. And all of this, by the way, assumes that the software has been deployed already. It's deployed already in production, turned off. All of it. And so what I did was I created a screenplay. I'm kind of a movie buff, right? So I wrote a screenplay that essentially is actors, characters, actions, and act one, scene one, and then definition of done at the end of it. Once again, don't try to read that. It's awful. But the idea was to make truth statements and say, in the first scene, we're going to deploy this, we're going to flip a flag, and then we're going to smoke test. And I put the names on it to say who was liable. And then at the end of it, at the very bottom, note, at this point, no user-facing system behaves differently. JWTs are supported, but dependent systems continue to function using legacy tokens. That's our definition of done. When we reach this milestone, we've set these flags, we've gone through the smoke tests, we're done. And then what we do is we sit on it for a couple of days and see if any defects come in. And then we move. And what we figured out was we could roll back at any point. We could stop at any point if we needed to retool or refigure how the next step was supposed to work. We could look at external dependencies. And the main thing I did to protect my own hide, but it turned out to be a really great exercise, was the team leads, everyone was in the room. And when we went over the plan, every one of them nodded their head. And we said, yes, this is the plan. This is the right way to go. Speak up now, or you cannot blame anyone. We're all in this together. And then you test until it is boring. We did a lot of tests. Now, in the end, 13 services, 9 run-throughs. And the cool thing was that at the end of the 9th run-through, somebody said, can we just stop doing this already? Because the first run-through, we turned the first flag on, the whole thing died in the lower environment. Second run-through, we got about to the third flag and everything died. By the 9th run-through, we're bored. When you're bored, it's probably time to ship. No more drama. You know what the tests are, you know what the flag sequence is, and you can be absolutely confident. We had 0 bugs. Massive effort. So I wanted this to be my full-time job, and they said, we shouldn't really ever have to do this again. Why in the world would we have to do something so stupid as to apply one thing to all 13 microservices again? It's like, well, we just got done doing it. Of course we're going to do it again. And that's why I'm talking about this anti-pattern for half of my speech here, is because this is probably going to be the rule, not the exception. When things go smoothly, you don't spend any time on them. So I hear stories like this fairly often about how this kind of thing happens. Yeah, it shouldn't happen. But it absolutely will, because we haven't nailed this microservice thing as an industry quite yet. So, we've got about 5 minutes left. I think these are just echoing what I have just said. I still think it's a net positive, though. So I would be curious, as we're here, to hear some stories from some of you, maybe offline when we're done here. I want to hear how this is going, because this information that I have, this story, is about 18 months old now. And I bet the industry has moved on. I bet there are some better stories out there, and there has been more success and more interesting things that have happened since then. So I want to be able to update this story and encourage other people to tell their own stories as it goes. Are there any questions? Because that's about all I got. I explained it that well? Yes, I can't hear.
Sure. This is kind of technical, but my company's been looking into kind of refactoring some of our monoliths that are just kind of hanging around, and we were looking into using gRPC to just make the service contracts between our different services a lot stronger. Did your teams use that or something similar?
No, we used strictly REST APIs behind GraphQL, pretty much for the whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sure someone around here might have some example, but no, that was our sort of mission, is not to complicate anything more than that, luckily.
All right.
Oh, cool. These lights are really bright, like really bright.
I'm curious, what's your team's approach to the contract testing?
We use this tool called Shiva. Like I said, it's been released open source. We had an internal version of it, but it's been released. That was a lot of what we did. Was we used a JavaScript tool that would generate our base test cases based on the Swagger doc. So it would analyze the Swagger doc, introspect, generate JavaScript test cases based on that, and then we would expand those based on edge cases and stuff like that we found. We definitely had a mantra throughout this exercise that. We tried to do sort of the least amount of acceptable testing. We didn't do the sort of go all out, run 900 tests every time. Just run 40 or 50 headless smoke tests, and try to make sure that we hit the most important things and move fast.
And how did you spell Shiva?
SHIVA.
Okay, thank you.
Shiva, yeah. It was. Let me know how you find that, because we used a version of it internally that worked rather well. I'd be curious to see if it's been. I'm not sure the community has kept up with it. I haven't followed, but it was a good project. There are also others out there that work with Java, I believe, that point to Swagger, generate test cases.
Marcus?
Yes.
So the Shiva tool you're mentioning about is an open source one?
It should be, yes.
And it uses Swagger underneath?
Yes. No, it doesn't use Swagger underneath. You point to a Swagger URL, and it generates test cases.
Okay.
I should have included a link, and I apologize. But I think, yeah, it was a good tool.
Marcus?
Yes?
Hi. Do you have any best practices or words of wisdom surrounding the when to flip a feature flag? Because I tend to see that for my product, a lot of our errors in stability have to do with feature flags being turned on too early, or other services not being ready for the feature flag, that sort of thing.
My first idea is, better communication. It seems like if there's a dependency, that's a feature flag error is going to be caused by either dependencies or bugs in code. Probably dependencies in your case. It sounds like. If you turn it on and errors are happening, it's probably not within your service, right? It's happening as a result of some other thing that's going on outside of that flag, do you think? So I think this is where at Retail Me Not we followed a release management or release planning schedule where we planned everything 3 months in advance. We tried to coordinate all of the dependencies so that we understood them, and we would get together for 2 full days and have these conversations where we would map out the dependencies. And the conversation about feature flags arose out of that, like what has to be true in order for me to turn this flag on? And if you can answer that question, then you should be able to communicate with the teams that you depend on to find out how to coordinate the release. That's the first thing that comes to mind. I got some other ideas, but that's first thing.
All right.
Cool.
Let's give Marcus a round of applause.
Cool, thanks.